Yeah, hi there, Victor Proud speaking to you, anarchist artist. Yeah, today I feel like sharing a few thoughts about Larken Rose and Lawrence Southern and the debate that they had on the issue of borders. But more fundamentally, I'd like to discuss something that's much more fundamental, and that's well, anarchism versus statism. But insofar as the debate was concerned, though, on the issue of borders, it was very revealing to me. And I'd like to share some of those thoughts, give you something to think about, mull it over, and do listen very carefully. Put aside what you're doing right now, sit down, have a drink with me. Just going to be 10, 15 minutes, not so much of your time. Consider these thoughts. Okay. Anarchism as a philosophical orientation, as a philosophical stance, I guess you could say, is one that does involve philosophy. And in this case, let's take a look at what can be considered the obvious, that in this case, it involves within philosophy that department known as ethics. And what is the anarchism in which we frame our worldview around? What is the principle that we orient ourselves to framing our position when it comes to anarchism? And that's the non-aggression principle, of course. And we, as libertarians, maybe even a lot of conservatives, just very shaky though, but certainly philosophically grounded anarchists know the difference between initiatory force and what constitutes force, and that between initiating force, and the difference between that and non-aggression, self-defense. Very, very much an ethical divide there between initiatory violence, the initiation of violence, whether that takes the form of a punch to the face, a knife to the gut, attempting to rape somebody, to imprison them, to kidnap them, to physically restrain them, to steal their wealth, to steal a portion of their property, to take their life, the ultimate property. All of this comes down to physical harm, entertainment, the use of physical force versus leaving people alone, just going about minding your own goddamn business, engaging in all different types of relationships, whether that be personal, whether that be economic, but doing it on a voluntary basis. That's why it is, if anarchy sounds like too much of a scary word, we have, of course, voluntarism. What is your philosophical, ethical, political, if you want to put it that way, orientation? What is the framework in which you define yourself? That's one of non-aggression, one of being of a voluntarist or an anarchist or a libertarian in this case, as you might very well believe. Notwithstanding, you're calling for a state, however small or constitutionally based. But that does lead us into the thrust of what really is the difference here. Now, the difference here is the difference between non-aggression and the initiation of force, and that clashing with, of course, self-defense or just leaving people alone. Of course, two separate moral categories. Now, the issue of the borders, though, is there a fundamental ethical divide between closed borders versus open borders? Closed borders versus open borders. Is there an ethical divide there? Well, my friends, as far as where I'm concerned, and this is probably going to be hard for a few people to understand, because to this day they still don't get it, or they're seeking out to misunderstanding me, to making it a point to misunderstand me. And for those who are making it a point to misunderstand me, do not concern me. But we have to step back and take a look at the larger picture here. Now, the larger picture is that we have to understand that philosophy is riddled with false dichotomies. Let's start there first before I jump onto the issue of where I stand on the borders. Let's just take back and take a larger picture with the type of false dichotomies that has riddled philosophy for hundreds of years, and still has a bearing upon the thinking, upon the social zeitgeist of where we find ourselves today, where there's all types of people running around with false economies in their head because they picked it up from the predominant culture and all of its sticky goo of where things have gone awry. Whether that's because of the mainstream media or because of the state of modern education, what's happening in the universities today is because of public schooling. There's all types of faulty thinking. Now, the philosophy and the culture is riddled with false dichotomies. Let's take some of the obvious ones that pop off the top of my head. The moral versus the practical. There's a false dichotomy that we've all come to encounter in other people, or perhaps we ourselves are suffering from this intellectual ailment, and believing that the practical versus the moral, that to be moral means to be self-sacrificial, in fact, as far as some people are concerned, but that's not practical, you see. To be moral is to be like, it's to be floating off into the heavens. It's something that you do in this world where you undermine your life, because to be ethical means to be focused on the supernatural, to be focused on the world to come, where you have to take accounting of your actions here. So it's not here in this lowly material realm. You know, it's up there, up into the lofty heavens. You see, that's the moral versus the practical, and you also have that with the mind-body dichotomy as well. You know, where platonic love, and then there's the physical and sexual, and it's all lust, and it's all lust based. So the physical versus the body, or the soul for that matter. And so you have the moral versus the practical, the body versus the soul, or the mind versus the body, and so forth. So and then you also have that when it comes to the borders, it's a false dichotomy. It's a false dichotomy to argue between open and closed borders because of the fact of the matter that the state is still in existence, and it's calling on the shots of whether those borders are to be open or closed. It's calling the shots. It's still compulsory. It's still the initiation of force, no matter how you cut it. It doesn't open its borders, and this is not something to celebrate. The anarchist doesn't celebrate that because it's opened by permission. And it invites a whole slew of other problems. We have to think contextually here. What is the larger picture of everything else that's hovering about the state? What are some of its other laws that has a bearing on whether the borders are open or not? Does this government, has it legally disarmed the people from defending themselves? Are they hurtling in at an enormous rate, an influx of low IQ people from very hostile regions, and where those people do not intend to assimilate, and where these people are very potentially dangerous, as they've proven to be, or where there's a welfare state, and as I've mentioned, the hate speech laws, in which any criticisms of the government's actions in regards to the borders, if there's any criticisms, that you will be visited by the authorities, where there's a clamping down on free speech. All of this issues whirling around the state. You have to take into account the total picture on the question of open borders and closed borders. Now, I argue that Larken Rose approaches the issue of the borders that if it's open, it's an inherent good. Yes, there's still a state there. The state is still in existence, but as an inherent good, at least that's a crack in the door. There's some splattering of freedom has been offered. The principle here is that, yes, open the border. That's the principle. It's not the principle, for Christ's sakes. The principle is the state versus the individual, a totally free anarchist society versus a centrally controlled, top-down hierarchy, violent hierarchy, authority, centralized force, a monopoly on the use of force, a government, the definition of a government, versus a totally principally based, property-based, individually rights recognizing society, a civilized society, a scientifically oriented society, one that's based on the Western canon, that has brought us the greatest amount of freedom that the world has ever seen, regardless of all of its incursions and infringements. That's not to be blamed on the West. They're fighting against that. That's the battle. Yes, there's Western imperialism, for Christ's sakes. There's a vast difference, the difference, the fundamental ethical clash between third world countries that you find in the East, that you find in Islamic countries, theocracies from hell, excuse me, versus more of a restrained government based on a more civilized people, by and large, regardless of all the errors and the faults. But the West is in a clash with the East, and there's a clash between the state and the individual. The question of open or closed borders are derivative matters, and you can't treat them as fundamentals, as fundamental primaries. And this is where the thinking goes all askew on these people sitting there. All the arguments over closed versus open borders, it's a ridiculous argument, for Christ's sakes. It does not deal with the fundamental questions, with the principle, with the fundamental ethical principle, which is aggression versus non-aggression. And where you have a government, you will always have aggression. Sometimes that aggression will even be greater if the borders are open, depending upon the total context of what else is happening within that type of government. As I've mentioned, whether it has hate speech laws, a welfare state, then you just escalate the aggression. If the whole idea of the non-aggression principle, where the anarchist tries to achieve, those who are outspoken, who have podcasts, who are out there, who do the groundwork, and offer the videos, make intellectual content, but they're intellectually activists. If your objective is to red pill people, to slap them awake from their intellectual complacency, to get some people something to think about in order to reduce the amount of violence in the world, then you have to ask, is that what you're doing when you're calling for an open border with the state still at the center of that society? Are you decreasing the odds or the actuality of physical force in the world? Are you escalating it or decreasing it? That's what you have to honestly look at. Look at the concrete physical facts of what's happening around. Take a look at the total picture. Don't be a concrete bound person, as Ayn Rand would say, where you can't see the larger principle, where you can't see the forest because you have your face pressed up against a fucking bark of wood on a tree. Step back, take a look at the total picture. That's what it means to be philosophical. That's what it means to be principally based. Be principled in your thinking, and you'll get the principle of the ethic right. This is Victor Pross, Pop Culture.